Now look, I want you to sit with me for a minute on this one, because most people are going to miss it entirely. It's the first week of July 2026, Ottawa, Ontario, somewhere in a government building, a deadline sits on a calendar, the kind of deadline that lives in a footnote of a trade agreement, the kind lawyers circle in red and nobody else notices. And on that date, that deadline passes. No press conference, no breaking news banner, just a quiet expiration. On the surface, this looks like paperwork, a formal review clause in a trade deal, coming and going the way clauses do. But if you look closer, and I mean really look, it tells you something about where this country's relationship with its biggest trading partner actually stands right now. And here's the thing. Most people watching didn't realize what actually happened when that deadline quietly blew past. Because underneath the paperwork, both countries just changed the terms of a 20-year bet. And it could end up costing American workers, American factories, and your own grocery bill a lot more than the tariff war everybody thinks they already understand. This touches the steel in the car you drive, the lumber in the house you're sitting in, the oil in your tank, and a trade relationship that a whole lot of American jobs were quietly built on top of. Now, there's a number I want you to hold on to. $10 billion. Just sit with that for a second. We're going to come back to it. Because that's the part of this story almost nobody is reporting on. And there's a date too, November 26. Hold on to that one as well. Because on that day, months before any of this made headlines, Ottawa made a quiet move that changes the entire shape of this fight. We'll get there, I promise you. To understand tonight, you've got to understand how we got here. Because the chain of events matters, and none of this started this month. Go back to March of 2025. The administration in Washington signs off on tariffs against Canada, 25% on most goods, 10% on energy and potash, using emergency powers, citing the flow of fentanyl across the northern border. Canada doesn't sit on its hands. Within days, Ottawa answers with retaliatory tariffs of its own. 25% on 30 billion Canadian dollars of American goods, everything from orange juice to motorcycles. When Washington adds tariffs on steel and aluminum on top of that, Canada answers again with tariffs on another $29 billion in American goods. All told, the plan on the table that spring was to eventually cover $155 billion in trade. Only part of that ever actually got used. And this fight didn't move in a straight line either. At one point that same March, the tariff threat on steel and aluminum briefly doubled to 50% in response to Canada's retaliation before getting walked back within hours. By that summer, there was open talk in Washington of pushing tariffs on Canada as high as 35%. It was threat, counter-threat, walk back, repeat, the kind of whiplash that makes a business owner on either side of the border afraid to sign a 5-year contract. Then comes the summer of last year. In late June, the Canadian government scraps a planned tax on American tech companies after Washington pauses trade talks over it entirely. And by August 22nd, Prime Minister Mark Carney stands at a podium in Ottawa and announces something that stuns a lot of his own supporters. Canada is going to remove most of its retaliatory tariffs, matching exemptions the United States already gives to goods that qualify under the North American trade deal. Tariffs on steel, aluminum, and autos stay in place. Almost everything else comes off. Opposition leader Pierre Poilievre accuses him of caving to Washington and breaking his own campaign promise. Leaders in Canada's steel industry and its steelworkers unions say the move leaves their sector exposed and call it a serious step backward. Carney frames it differently, he points out that, by his own accounting. More than 85% of Canada-US trade is already tariff-free under the deal, and holding on to tariffs nobody's really paying wasn't leverage, it was theater. And this is where it starts to get complicated. In February of this year, the U.S. Supreme Court rules that the emergency powers used to justify those original tariffs never actually authorized tariffs in the first place. Washington pivots almost overnight, replacing the old emergency tariffs with a new 10% global import surcharge under a different law entirely, Section 122 of the Trade Act, still exempting goods that meet the North American trade deal's rules. And that brings us to now, July of 2026, and the deadline that just passed. Every big trade fight is an echo of a choice made years earlier, folks. And this one is the echo of 2020, when the current North American trade deal first took effect with a built-in promise. Review it every 6 years, decide together whether to lock it in through 2042. That review deadline was July 1st, and it passed without an agreement to extend. Now let me be precise here, because the details matter more than anybody's spin, and there's a lot of spin out there tonight. Start with the size of what's actually at stake. According to the Congressional Research Service, Canada was the third largest source of American goods imports in 2024 at $412 billion and the single largest destination for American goods exports at $350 billion. Add in services, and Canada is America's second largest trading partner on the entire planet. This is not a side relationship. This is one of the 2 or 3 biggest economic relationships the United States has with anybody anywhere, and it runs both directions hard. Statistics Canada figures for 2025 show Canada sent 73% of everything it exported to the United States and pulled 46% of its imports from the United States. Energy is its own story entirely. Canada is the single largest supplier of energy imports to the US, crude oil, natural gas, electricity, all of it, and Canada's share of American crude oil imports. By volume, climbed from 41% back in 2015 to 64% last year. Let that sink in. Almost 2 out of every 3 barrels of oil the US brings in from abroad now comes from Canada. And it's not just goods moving across that border, it's ownership too. As of the most recent year on record, the United States was the single largest source of foreign investment in Canada at roughly $460 billion, and Canada was the second largest source of foreign investment in the United States at nearly $730 billion. Folks, that's not 2 countries trading with each other at arm's length. That's 2 economies that have grown into each other's foundations. Here's a number worth holding in your mind. By Prime Minister Carney's own accounting, the average U.S. tariff rate on Canadian goods now sits around 5.6%, which he says is the lowest rate the U.S. applies to any trading partner on Earth. That's what's left after most of the retaliatory tariffs came off the table. But the sectors that stay protected are the ones that actually hurt. Steel and aluminum tariffs out of Washington sit at 50%. Canada, for its part, has held its own retaliatory rate on those goods at 25% rather than escalating to match it. Softwood lumber carries a 10% U.S. tariff on top of existing duties, and furniture and cabinetry made from Canadian wood-face tariffs that climbed as high as 30 and even 50% by the start of this year. And now, back to that number I asked you to hold. $10 billion. On November 26 of last year, Prime Minister Carney announced new Canadian tariffs and tighter quotas on imported steel. Not aimed at the United States this time, but aimed at cheap, non-market steel flooding in globally, tied largely to overcapacity out of places like China. Legal analysts tracking the announcement put the initial list of affected steel products at roughly $10 billion in value. It's Canada quietly building its own wall while the loud tariff war with Washington soaked up every headline. Now let me put my analyst hat on for a minute, because the strategy underneath all of this is worth examining closely. Carney's play was never simple retaliation. Removing most of the counter tariffs while holding the line hard on steel, aluminum, and autos, that's not surrender, and it's not defiance either. That's triage. He gave up leverage on goods that weren't hurting Washington much anyway in order to keep leverage on the 3 or 4 sectors where actual Canadian jobs live. And the November steel quota move did something clever underneath it all. It let Ottawa say to Washington, in effect, we are not your back door for underpriced foreign steel, which quietly takes the air out of one of the U.S. administration's oldest complaints about Canada. But here's the part that should worry you more than any tariff percentage. That CUSMA review deadline passing without an extension agreement doesn't blow up the trade deal. It survives, folks. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. But it shifts the whole relationship from a locked-in 6-year guarantee to something that gets relitigated every single year, all the way out to 2036. It's not a blowout. It's a slow leak. And slow leaks are harder to see coming than blowouts are. So who actually pays for that uncertainty? Ask yourself that. It isn't the politicians standing at podiums in Ottawa or Washington. It's the steel mill in Ohio explaining to its bank why its raw material costs get re-examined annually now instead of once every 6 years. It's the auto plant in Michigan that can't lock in a 5-year parts contract with the confidence it used to have. It's the sawmill in British Columbia that doesn't know if next July brings stability or another fresh threat. 3 different towns, 3 different countries in spirit, if not on the map, all paying the same invisible tax. And because Canada supplies close to 2/3 of America's imported crude oil, this cuts in a direction a lot of people don't expect. Tariff friction and trade uncertainty on the northern border don't just squeeze Canadian producers, they ripple straight into American refiners, American utilities, and eventually the price at the pump and the number on your heating bill. This was never a one-way fight where only Canada bleeds. That's the piece most of the coverage leaves out entirely. Now I want to be fair here because this isn't about one party, and honestly, it isn't about one country either. Carney's critics inside Canada have a real point. Giving up roughly 90% of your retaliatory leverage in exchange for exemptions Washington was arguably going to grant anyway was a gamble. And steelworkers who watched their industry stay exposed while consumer goods got a pass are right to be frustrated about it. But let me say something that won't be popular with the part of this audience that's naturally sympathetic to Ottawa. Some of Washington's underlying complaints about Canada aren't manufactured out of thin air. Canada's dairy, egg, and poultry system limits domestic production and restricts imports by design. And Washington has formally challenged Canada's dairy quotas more than once under the very trade deal at the center of this fight. Last June, Canada actually passed legislation locking in those protections, barring its own government from loosening dairy and poultry quotas in future talks no matter what. That's not a fabricated grievance. That's a real long-standing friction point sitting right at the center of the table. And neither government has exactly been a model of steady commitment this past year. Ottawa scrapped a planned tech tax the moment Washington applied real pressure. Washington itself pivoted from one legal basis for tariffs to another within days of losing at the Supreme Court without missing a beat. Both capitals have shown more than once that they'll abandon a firm public position fast when it becomes politically convenient. That's not a partisan critique. That's simply what the record shows on both sides of this border. And if you're the kind of viewer who wants a clean villain in this story, I'm going to disappoint you tonight. There isn't one. There's a government in Ottawa managing a country where one export dollar in 5 depends on staying inside the American market. And there's a government in Washington managing a country that just discovered the hard way in front of its own Supreme Court that it built an entire tariff strategy on legal ground that wasn't actually there. Neither one of those is a cartoon. I see 3 roads from here, and I want to be honest with you about all 3 of them. Scenario A, the best case. Both governments actually use these new annual reviews as a working tool instead of a political stage. Small disputes over dairy, lumber, and steel quotas get resolved one clause at a time instead of exploding into fresh tariff fights. Steel and aluminum duties gradually step down as trust rebuilds on both sides, and that 5.6% average tariff becomes the floor for nearly everything instead of the exception carved out around a wall of sector tariffs. Scenario B, the muddle. Every summer becomes its own small trade crisis. Threats get floated in June, a patch gets negotiated in July, and everyone exhales until the next year rolls around. Steel, aluminum, and lumber tariffs stay elevated more or less permanently. Nothing collapses, but nothing really heals either, and businesses on both sides of the border just learn to budget for chronic uncertainty as the new normal, the way you'd budget for a bad winter you know is coming. Scenario C, and I want you to hold on to this one because it's the one that keeps me up at night. Somebody in Washington or somebody in Ottawa decides a bad political year is the moment to walk away for good well ahead of that 2036 expiration date. Steel, aluminum, and auto tariffs harden from temporary walls into permanent ones. The United States loses reliable access to the energy cushion Canada provides. Canada loses the market that buys nearly 3/4 of everything it sells abroad. Nobody wins that version of the story. Everybody just loses a little more slowly and a little more quietly than they expected to. My honest assessment? Somewhere between A and B, leaning toward B, because right now, neither leader has the domestic room to be the one seen giving ground twice in a row. Now let me pay off what I promised you earlier, because I don't like leaving loops open on you. That $10 billion Carney's November steel move, that's the real insurance policy sitting underneath this entire story, quieter than any tariff headline. Built to protect Canadian industry no matter which way Washington swings next. And November 26th, the date I asked you to hold on to, that's the day Ottawa stopped playing pure defense and started building something of its own on its own terms. Remember that the next time somebody tells you Canada only ever reacts and never plans. I've seen this country, and I've seen the one across that northern border, do hard things before. I believe both of them can do hard things again. Trade relationships this deep, built up over decades, don't unravel in a single news cycle, and they don't get repaired in one either. They get rebuilt one honest, unglamorous, unphotographed review meeting at a time. So here's what I'm asking of you tonight. Stay engaged with this story past the headlines. Mark your own calendar for next July, because that's when the next annual review comes around, and it deserves the same attention this one just got, not less. And talk to the neighbor who sees this differently than you do. The one who says it's all Washington's fault. Or the one who says it's all Ottawa's fault. Because the truth, like it usually is sitting somewhere quietly in between them, waiting for somebody to go looking for it. That's what I'm asking you to think about tonight. Take care of each other.